Welcome in, everybody. My name is Brett. I work on the marketing side with OpenSpatial. So today's webinar topic is including open source solutions in your GIS strategy. So as you guys know, open source used to be a fringe topic for a while, and it's become much more mainstream over the last couple of decades. And so it's become something that is a very realistic competitor in terms of GIS strategy and can be very strategic moving forward. So we wanted to create a space for a little bit of conversation, dialogue, and also talk about how things like PostGIS, QGIS, and GeoServer can form the foundation of an enterprise GIS environment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Johan and Andrew. If you guys want to do a brief introduction, and we can jump in.
Good morning. So I'm Andrew Dunlop from OpenSpatial. So I've been with the business for about 7 years now. Very interested in the open source topic, and OpenSpatial is very committed to open standards, etc. Today, I think will be a good session for us to talk about some of our knowledge in that space, and looking forward to interacting. So over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, I'm Johan now. I'm CTO of OpenSpatial. Been with the company for more than 25 years and responsible for some strategic directions, etc. And yeah, we'll be talking about including open source in your GIS strategy, what some of the implications. Now, some of it will be the technology side, some of it will be on the business side, and we will have chance for questions later on. And typically, the target audience, we are looking at state, local government, utilities interested in the GIS advancements. We'll be looking at architecture and standards, best practice in terms of implementations. We look at open source and enterprise integration, and then the expectation for a strategic adoption of open source and standard-based solutions. So why does this matter now? There's a few things in terms of government and policy. So it is a question of why and how. And so in terms of the first thing is, would I be allowed to implement open source solutions? So the Australian government has got open source policies since 2011. So it mandates fair consideration of open source software in ICT procedures. And so that's a fairly important part of the entire process. Now, Queensland has specified that they encourage agencies to evaluate and release open source solutions. So it's not only adopt open source solutions, but also when they develop their own environments to make that open source as well, to promote investment and interoperability. Victoria and New South Wales wasn't that specific in terms of the specifying that it's must, but supporting open source within the environment is very much part of the ICT infrastructure guidelines, etc. that you have. So the question then is, in terms of using open source solutions, that is a fairly important part, that there is federal government support for the process. So talking to IT, it's not, oh, this is totally out there and we can't do anything with that. Adoption of open standards, the OGC or Open Geospatial Consortium has been around for quite a long time. And the technology trends favor open standards. If you look at the OGC Simple Feature Specification and the ISO 19125 for spatial data, GIS platforms. So there's quite a wide variety of different software processes and standards that underpin the spatial data models used across modern platforms. So if you look at any of the major GIS vendors, do support the OGC standards. Now there's different levels of implementation and support of those standards, but the open source component of implementing the standard is a very much part of that process. There's a strategic technology alignment that we have within the technology processes that you have. So in terms of making sure that you can actually implement open source software within a OGC-compliant environment is a very important part, and it can give you cost-effective GIS governance within your environment. So one of the issues there is, if there's only one typical vendor, what you then have is either stagnation, or the typical thing in terms of monopoly is cost going up, with people implementing or revenue becoming an important factor. Implementing open source can actually give you a lot of flexibility within that process. So what is some of the challenges within government and utilities? Legacy GIS or proprietary data structures limit your integration and can increase your operational inefficiencies within the organization. Then you've got the regulatory and cybersecurity pressures. There's all these standards now, standard that was acceptable 10 years ago and 5 years ago is not acceptable anymore. Security is always a moving target. So from an IT perspective and from an implementation perspective, that's an important consideration, how to use that and implement that, to say, okay, am I just going to take something and implement it and deploy it myself? That has got implications in terms of your servers and staffing, etc., and making sure that from an organization perspective that you are meeting the security standards, etc. But there are ways that you can actually overcome that. So your infrastructure and workforce support, so maintaining that critical infrastructure with the both on-premise as well as mobile workforces, and that obviously increase the operational complexity that you have. And then standardization across jurisdictions, efforts to standardize the processes add a further amount of complexity in the process. So if we then look at a data for first standard-led architecture, some of the components would be then firstly your spatial databases like PostGIS now, or other OGC-compliant databases. So you've got the SQL Server Spatial, you've got the Oracle Spatials, etc. That's also OGC compliant, but they are not open source. They are closed source software. You've got the spatial databases then like PostGIS, based on PostGIS, give you high fidelity geometry storage. So putting your data in a database instead of a file-based system is a fairly important part within that process. But in today's environment, there's a variety of different ways where data is distributed. So everything doesn't have to be on-premise nowadays. With the advent of cloud and then distributed services, we can consume data from state government, etc., add complexity to that whole environment. So what is the data that you're responsible for, and what is the data that you're going to use? That is where the OGC services interface. So something like GeoServer uses your OGC interfaces like WMS, WFS, Web Map Service, Web Feature Service, Web Catalog Service, and Web Map Tile Service. Enable cross-platform GIS interoperability so that both in terms of publishing, making your data available to others, as well as consuming the data is an important part of the process. Now, GeoServer is some of the reference implementations of the OGC specification for some of these features. So that's one of the widely adopted environments to use within the distribution and consumption of the data. So the database is the first component. Your web services is the second component in there. The third one is, how am I going to talk to other systems? How's my integrations going to work? And that is where the OGC has got its API. So that features a modern RESTful integration for your dashboards, mobile apps, data pipelines, how to do that. So that gives a common standard how you can interact with the data. And then with the RESTful services, it's a lot easier today to implement than it used to be. And with a common OGC API for an implementation, that gives you the framework how to do that. It gives you a lot more standardization across the process. And then in terms of a desktop GIS client, so there's QGIS is a standards compliant desktop client for editing, cartography, spatial analysis workflows. It is a very mature product. It is very well supported, and QGIS is a very important part of that process. Now, there's a lot movement. If you look at things like open layers, etc., editing in a web environment, in addition to something like your QGIS desktop, becomes a lot more important and becoming a lot more viable in today's environment. That is another part that you can look at and consider. But in today's environment, there's the whole cloud environment, cloud readiness, AI, etc. how does that then fit into this whole environment? Do I put everything on premise? Do I move it to the cloud? What's all the implementation? So the cloud assessment framework guides agencies in understanding your shared cloud responsibility, managing the shared risks, etc. So there's a variety of different cloud providers. You've got the Amazon's and Microsoft and Google and Oracle, for example. So those are your typical tier one cloud providers and working within those environments. Then for the Australian side, you've got the IRAP risk-based model. That is the Australian Defence Force that has been tasked with the security for the Australian government. So they've got the risk-based model, and so they do IRAP assessments. And that's a fairly important part for your protected data level readiness. And all of the cloud-based providers that is based in Australia have had to do the IRAP risk-based model to get the classification that it is then supported for your environments. Then there's a few things like your cloud optimized geospatial format. So we've got a few terms to throw around here. Formats like COG or cloud optimized GeoTIFF, that is then better for the cloud rather than your traditional GIS still around very much. Your Mapbox vector tiles is a very important part of that in terms of improving your bandwidth, improving your speed within the process, as well as still giving your interoperability that you can work with is an important part of that. And then stack your spatial temporal asset catalog, that is then spatial data with a time-based component to actually build, make that available is an important part of that. Give you your platform efficiency and then to give you the support for your scalable spatial data management that you can then work with. So all of those are open source components. Now, what a lot of the vendors do is they actually take a lot of the open source software and then put a wrapper around that. And if you look at vendors like both Autodesk and Esri, for example, have got up to 90 open source components embedded within their platform. So they actually, even the first tier vendors actually base a lot of their systems on open source. If you look at the GDAL libraries, the Proj libraries for projections, etc. So all of the vendors actually use the open source components to do their environments. It is not out there type of separate thing. A lot of the vendors actually build around the open source. They just include it within the environment. But then if you look at, is open source free? The software licensing is free, but the infrastructure and the people managing the infrastructure is not free. So that's where things like, is that something that I'm going to take on myself so that I'm going to implement it on my own environment, or are we going to do that in a cloud environment? Now, if you put it in a cloud environment, there's the secure cloud deployments where you can actually ensure a secure, performant, and standard compliant cloud spatial system. So it's a question of, do I do it myself, or is there a way that I can actually implement that in a cloud environment that I don't have to take on some of the responsibility for the security and single sign-on and integrations and doing the APIs and integration with my other systems. So that is then providers like OpenSpatial comes into the picture. So within the security framework, there's the ISO 27001. So that offers a comprehensive system to protect your data confidentiality, your integrity, and the availability. So it's important that your cloud provider, for example, have got those things. You've got the compliance, SOC 2 compliance. That is also then security, privacy, and availability for the cloud solution. So that's also then important that your cloud provider has got that information. The Australian one, the Essential 8 maturity model, which is a evolving process, helps agency mitigate cyber threats using your current threat intelligence and practices. So that evolves over time as you work with the data that you can ensure. That's also the Australian government process on that. You've got the IRAP security assessments, working with the data. And a fundamental part of that when you're doing software development is doing it that is built from the ground up with security in mind and not slapping security on the end. That's a fairly fundamental part of how to do that, and a fundamental part of the development life cycle, especially with today with AI being involved in the development processes, making sure that security doesn't fall by the wayside and that the security assessments is still in place. So how would I go through deployment? So you've got the options. You can have it on-premise. On-premise give you full control of your infrastructure and the data, but then it also gives you a responsibility for all the maintenance and the compliance within that. You can do a hybrid component where you can have certain things on-premise and then certain things off-site. So you can have your on-premise system. Let's say I want to publish certain things to the cloud. So I want to do a embed on my corporate website certain of the maps that I have, and I can then host that within the cloud. So it gives you I've got my own data, but I can actually do certain things in a hybrid environment. Put that in the cloud, gives you the scalability, etc., that you don't have to then give access to your on-premise data directly from the outside world. Or you can go actually to a managed platform. So that gives you that offloads the operational task in making sure the environment is there and you've got the uptime, making sure the patching is happening, that you don't have to do the whole upgrades every time within the environment with all the IT implications that you have, the backups happening, the monitoring, checking for open standards compliance. So that's still a very important part of the overall process. So how would I go about that process? So adoption roadmap would be look at evaluating your existing spatial data and then looking at these OGC-compliant schemas within databases that you can actually go and deploy that. Now, it can be in PostGIS, it can also be in other databases like Oracle or SQL Server that is still OGC-compliant depending on your environment, but that gives you interoperability within your open source stack that is also then OGC-compliant. Your service publication standards, so just on that previous one, that's important that you don't have vendor lock-in on your data, that only one environment can access the data. Interoperability and availability of that data is very important, that you can actually publish that and make that available. So service publication standards, so that's the thing. Do you publish it with the OGC standards, WMS, WFS, using the OGC API to give you the necessary integration, working with a variety of data sources. So that's quite an important part of that you can actually consume the data, but then also make your data available to the outside. QGIS is a very cost-effective desktop solution in terms of your desktop editing that reduces your licensing cost, giving you the spatial analysis capabilities. Now, QGIS has got a lot of plugins available, so that is part of the whole ecosystem where if there's functionality that is not available, there's a lot of plugins available that will give you the ability to do a lot of things. You can have a CAD-like interface. There's a lot of plugins available from a lot of environments. Now, QGIS Desktop 4 is launching this week, so that's quite a major new release for the QGIS Desktop, and it is an important part of that process. And a fundamental part is how do I do my editing on a corporate database? And if I'm going to put that in a cloud environment, how will we handle that communication, the security, making sure your user management and connection to your central database, how would all of that work? So that there's a variety of options to enable that within your environment. Then you've got your governance and operational standards. Implement your governance structures, so schema management, your plugin control, your metadata stewardship, your disaster recovery, and aligning that with your maturity goals, so that if in terms of organizational change management, where all of that would be in place within your environment. So there's a few use case patterns that you have. So local government integration, so there's a lot of local governments already using open source software, integration with your planning, your property, your asset data for transparency and efficiency. So part of that is I've got my database, but what is the APIs that's available that I can actually do the integration between the GIS and asset management system? There's all the move from an asset perspective to embed a lot of the spatial data within the asset management system. But at the end of the day, it is the question of who's the master of that data and being able to manage that. There's certain things that asset management system will do better. But from a spatial data GIS point of view, there's a lot of areas that the asset management system won't touch. The asset management GIS is not going to take over the entire GIS infrastructure. There's the state level spatial framework. There's the various frameworks for that, and making sure that you can actually consume that data. Landpick is actually making the spatial data available from a synchronization perspective with PostGIS at the moment. Definite movement within that direction in terms of using the open source database level dissemination of data as well. You've got utility network modeling, spatial database for complex network modeling. So there's a variety of network models available, connectivity. So there's two directions in terms of the utility modeling that we see within the environment. A very complex one or a more simplified one. We've seen a lot of people doing, take years to actually build a fairly complex model, migrate your data within that whole environment in order to achieve something like a network trace. And so you can actually properly work with your model. Doesn't have to be that complex to build it, but in terms of the analysis, you can actually achieve that data. So that really depends where you actually go and build that functionality. And then the next component is your mobile field operation. Can I take my data out into the field? Can I go and edit that? It will go into your central repository with your real-time data collection and decision-making within the council or the utility for that. So your data capture and the data capture flowing from external organizations into your organization. How does all of that fit together? Can I take that data coming from external organization, load that without having to recapture everything, that you can actually bring that data into your environment? So what's some of the common concerns implementing? So security depends on your governance and your operational discipline. So IT very much is a part of that process. It's not only just a licensing model, but proper configuration meet your key security standard. So that is where it becomes practical to say that let's do it in a cloud environment where we have got a hosted environment where we are sure this has been implemented and has been worked with it, with all the ISO models, etc. Can it work with other enterprise systems? Yes, it cannot coexist with other enterprise systems in a standard search first architecture, but preserving your consistency and your flexibility. The best tool for specific workloads is a good way of actually doing that. So important part of that is the flexibility to say, how would I enable my data, the sharing of my data in an easy widget-based interface that I can go and say, here's my data, and go and publish that as a map, or it can then both be internal or external. We can then go and say, I've got a specific use case for a specific group of users that you can easily compile and work with that data. But an important part of that is to say, if I now have a number of these plugins and data that I have, that it then becomes quite an important part is to say, if I've now published this, how would I ensure that if I change something on one system that is not going to break another system, if I change my style that is shared in between different systems, that it's not going to break other systems without having to duplicate the data, and being able to look at that information, manage that information, and see what is impacted is a quite important part of that. So the whole user management, from who's accessing the data, who can see the data, using a role-based management approach that you can actually see from an organization exactly who has got access to what. How does the data look? How does the data work? Keeping control of your entire environment is an important part of what you would need to do. So typically, strategy roadmap, doing it as a phased implementation plan. So look at your environment assessment, look at your data quality, your system dependence, compliance requirements within your current environment, your architecture definition, data first standards led architecture. with the spatial database as a core storage component. So a very important part of that your spatial database is a central repository and the master of your spatial data, that you can actually manage that information. Now, that spatial database can be on premise or it can be on the cloud, depending on your organization, implementation, etc. So you can do a pilot project validation, validate the concept, and build your internal capability for the approach. And then your governance and deployment, introduce your policies and expand the deployment and then getting feedback as you go along, and still making sure you've got that security. So you've got to keep IT happy, you've got to keep engineering all happy, all their teams within the organization. So taking them along on that journey. So as a summary, combining open source with enterprise ecosystem give you a flexible, interoperable, and future-proof platform. So that's a fairly important part of that, is looking at the technology stack, making sure you pick something that is being maintained, that has got quite a wide support within the open source community. And that means that it is being future-proof. It's sustainable by open standards, so it's not off into a tangent. That ensures long-term sustainability and compliance with your national and state policies, security and governance framework through ISO, IRAP, etc., Essential 8, etc., and then your modernization and service delivery. OpenSpatial can assist you with the data-first architecture roadmap to actually help you with modernizing your GIS, reducing the technical debt, and improve the services within your environment. Time for questions. So I'm going to hand back to Brett.
Perfect. Thank you, Johan, for that nice discussion. Yeah, so we want to go ahead and open it up for a time for questions or comments.
Brett, sorry, just to interrupt. There's a couple of questions that quite often get raised. One of those is for open source, is whether there's a depth of community of users. So there's often a depth of community for the developers, but whether there's a depth of community for users. Applications like QGIS, etc., have a huge depth of users. So you're not training someone from scratch generally when you're employing someone. And quite often that's a concern from management, is that, okay, if we went with a commercial off-the-shelf vendor, there's a community there with resources that we can employ readily. With open source, it's matured to the state now where you've got a lot of GIS professionals that have got open source application experience already. So that's one of the key highlights to management when they are considering where they may move to next as far as their GIS strategy is concerned. So the same goes with integrating with websites, etc. So you may have your IT department turning around saying, that's great, you've built an open source application which has got a website, but how do I expand that further? A development that gets done on open layers, etc. It's got a very rich depth of being able to modify websites and deliver what your business may need. And the likes of GeoServer, Johan mentioned GeoServer, it does underpin a lot of the functionality that you may need to serve up internally and externally. It does take a little bit of management on GeoServer, especially on the initial configuration, but it is quite intuitive once it's set up, and the power of what you can deliver and unleash your data utilizing something like GeoServer from open source is quite rich, quite feature rich, and really does unlock your data. The other bits that sort of get you may be asked is, I go with a commercial off-the-shelf GIS product, I don't have to worry about whether I can access data directly from the database or not. Now that may be true, and certainly the API components that are made available are very important. When you start to work with real heavy loads of data sets, etc., the APIs start to become a bit of a bottleneck for you. So whilst it's very important to have those integrations through the API, when you start to look at bulk loads, bulk processing, etc., having access to that data at the core of the database does open up a lot of opportunities for you to maximize your data, either within the GIS where it is the source of truth, or when you do need to do bulk loads into other systems, etc. So there's a few questions that quite often come up to us when considering whether open source is the right way forward. On the security side of things, the Essential 8, the IRAP, if you are looking to deploy on a cloud environment, IT, if they're open to cloud deployments, any of the tier one vendors that Johan mentioned, Oracle, AWS, Azure, they provide patching in those areas and live patching in those areas and provide a pretty strong model, especially with the open source applications there as well. It's something that is easily answered, especially on the cloud side of things. When it comes down to Essential 8, always remember that there's maturity levels of Essential 8. It'll depend on where your IT department sits on what maturity level they're expecting out of whatever the implementation is. If it's based on cloud, that maturity level needs to be quite high. So I too need to get involved on that side as well. So there are a few key questions that pop up from time to time. Thought I'd share those with you here. And just a little bit of a recap of what Johan presented there.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, super helpful. And it ties into one of the questions. So I see, Johan, it looks like you've answered it for everybody in the chat, but we got the question, can you provide some more info on GeoServer? Do you want to just give a quick little summary of what you sent, Johan, just for everybody to hear?
Yeah, GeoServer is OGC-compliant and actually one of the reference implementation for a variety of the OGC standards. So I've given you a link there in the page, and yeah, it can consume the data from your spatial database file systems, tile servers. It can actually do the backend tiling for you and in terms of your distribution. So if you've got, it supports any of the spatial databases, PostGIS, Oracle, SQL Server, etc., that it can consume the data, disseminate that data. And there's also publishing where, for example, if you've got your stylization in your QGIS, that is SLD, which is a standard layer description for OGC that is implemented in QGIS, you can actually publish that directly to GeoServer, and there's tools to do that so that where your stylization in your QGIS desktop environment can go into your web environment. So it's not a totally separate stylization component that you would need to do. And yeah, you can then easily deploy that within the environment, and you've got the performance, etc., that you would need in a desktop environment to be able to get the necessary performance that you would need. Yes, I don't know. Does that help, Paul? Or we can actually set up something for you later to that we can actually show you a few things if you're interested.
It looks like we did just get one more question. If you want to respond to this one quickly from Joseph, it says, can you explain a bit more on integrations with other systems, how to build, how that works with open source?
Okay, yep. So integration with other systems, what that would entail is, so the OTC has got a variety of different standards. So one of those is then actually an API that this is how you talk with the REST service. So there's, for example, well-known binary, well-known text, which is also OGC standards. There's JSON, which is an OGC standard of this is how you describe geometries within your environment to actually bring data in, to make it available, etc. In terms of making an integration component available, so that is a fairly important part of then saying, okay, I've got an integration that I would need to do to one of my external systems, whether that is the asset management system or one of my other corporate systems. So having an integration API component available that I can actually talk to the other system. That is where integrators such as ourselves come into the picture, where we've done this before with a variety of systems where you can actually either take that off the shelf or integration with most of the corporate systems, or being able to easily expand that into your environment. Yeah, we've done these integrations before, and we can easily assist you within that process to actually implement a API based or integration based on your OGC API standard RESTful interfaces that is then.
There's quite a few layers of integration that are available to you there. So Johan's touched on the RESTful API, which we do quite a bit of development internal. All of those RESTful API standards are pretty much open to anyone. So if you do have a development team or capability for development, that's all open to you there as well. We utilize Swagger to make things easily accessible across organizations. So predefined APIs, we do build those to integrate with different commercial systems. So that's something that we do. There's no reason why you can't go and do that yourself as well. serving up the XYZ tiles, WNTS tiles, etc., straight out of something like GeoServer, and then serving that into other applications is another way forward for you as well. So it really does come down to a case by case. How do you want to do the integration? What are you integrating with? And then selecting the right tool for the job for those. Hopefully that answers the questions.
Perfect. With that, I don't see any more questions coming through. So we want to thank you guys for attending, and we look forward to welcoming you at our next webinar.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. There's quite a lot of exciting things happening around the open source environments and making a lot more accessible, and AI implementations and the use of that makes it easier to implement something without relying totally on AI for your security, etc. Yeah, it's an important part of future direction within the GIS industry, we believe.
And if you have any questions, you can always reach out, openspatial.com, and all of our contact information is there as well. Thank you guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.